the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. Which era is the greatest of all time? We have witnessed many great players and many great moments throughout the course of NBA history. However, which NBA era would be considered to be the greatest? Some of you may think that the 90s is the greatest NBA era ever when Michael Jordan and the Bulls played. Jordan is the greatest player in NBA history, and the Bulls were arguably the greatest dynasty ever. Although, that doesn't necessarily mean that the 90s as a whole is the greatest NBA era ever. To determine the greatest era ever, we must consider three things: the skill level of an average superstar in each era, the amount of competition in each era, as well as the greatest players, teams, and exciting moments. We also need to consider that the possessions per game in 2022 is more than the possessions per game in 1980, given that all the numbers in our analysis will be per 100 possessions to account for the difference of pace. First, is a particular superstar in one era of the same caliber as a superstar in a different era? To establish this, we will take the averages for points, rebounds, and assists per 100 possessions for every player who was selected to an All-NBA team in their respective era. An average All-NBA player in the 1980s averaged 30.7 points, 10.1 rebounds, and 6.5 assists per 100. In the 90s, an average All-NBA player averaged 30.6 points, 10.7 rebounds, and 7 assists per 100. In the 2000s, they averaged 31.5 points, 11.1 rebounds, and 6.5 assists per 100. In the 2010s, they averaged 32.6 points, 11.1 rebounds, and 7.3 assists per 100. Finally, in the 2020s, an average All-NBA player averaged 35.8 points, 11.3 rebounds, and 8.7 assists per 100. Looking at these numbers on a bar graph, the average points per game per 100 possessions by an All-NBA player in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s were all pretty much the same. In the 2010s, the average slightly increased. In the 2020s, the average was more than 3 points higher than the previous era. For rebounds, every era had similar numbers. For assists, it pretty much followed the same trend as points. As we can see, there was little to no difference stat-wise for the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. The 2010s and after, on the other hand, saw a bump in production, with the 2020s seeing a 19% increase in assists. It's becoming pretty clear that players from the 2010s and the 2020s are the most skilled. Now, you might be wondering why the 50s, 60s, and 70s are not included in this video. They were not incorporated in the analysis because A, there were way less teams back then, and B, the data we needed for this video was not available. Sure, there was Wilt, Bill Russell, and Jerry West, and this may be hard for some fans to hear, but this was not the best era. Next, what about the level of competition in each era? Which era was the most competitive? To find the most competitive era, we'll identify how many teams on average had a net rating of +5 in each season from a given era. In the 80s, about 3 teams on average each season had a net rating of +5. In the 90s, about 5 teams each season on average had a +5 net rating. The 2000s on average also had about 5 teams with a +5 net rating each regular season. The 2010s on average had about 4 or 5 teams each season with a net rating of +5. And finally, the 2020s has so far had around 5 to 6 teams each season with a net rating of +5. Given all this, what would be the most competitive era? The numbers state that the 2020s is the most competitive era, but the 2020s just started, so we can't say anything definitive yet. That leaves us with the most competitive era being the 2000s. Now, statistically, the 2000s and 90s may appear quite similar, but they couldn't be more different. Yes, the turn of the century was dominated by Kobe and Shaq. But the years following, and even during the Lakers dynasty, were unpredictable. The 90s, on the other hand, while also being exciting and must-see TV, were dominated by mainly one team, namely the Chicago Bulls. As for the other decades in our comparison, the 2010s were dominated by LeBron and the Warriors, and the 80s were a similar story. We also need to consider exciting moments, players, and teams in each era. Looking at game winners, there was a total of 7 game-winning playoff buzzer beaters in the 1980s, 6 in the 1990s, 8 in the 2000s, 14 in the 2010s, and so far there has already been 4 playoff buzzer beaters in the 2020s. In terms of team performance, the best regular season record in the 80s was the 1985-86 Celtics, who won 67-15. In the 90s, the best season by a team was the 1995-96 Bulls with a record of 72-10. The best teams in the 2000s were the 2000 Lakers and the 2007 Mavericks, both having a record of 67-15. How on earth did the Mavericks lose in 5 to this team in the first round? In the 2010s, we all know the 2015-2016 Warriors went 73-9, only to blow a 3-1 lead in the finals, but that is a story for another time. In the 2020s, the best team so far was this past year's 2021-22 Phoenix Suns with a record of 64-18. Looking at the best players of each decade, for the 1980s, it will be Bird, Magic, Jordan, Kareem, Isaiah Thomas, Moses Malone, and Dr. J. For the 90s, it will be Jordan again, Hakeem, Shaq, David Robinson, The Mailman, Pippen, and Barkley. In the 2000s, we have Kobe, Duncan, LeBron, D-Wade, KG, AI, and Shaq for the second time. In the 2010s, the best players are LeBron James, Steph Curry, KD, Kawhi, James Harden, Westbrook, and CP3. Finally, for the 2020s, the best players so far will be Giannis, Jokic, Steph, Luka, Embiid, LeBron for the third time, and KD. I know, the lists are not perfect. They are just to get a sense of some of the good players in each era. Okay, back to the video. So, which era is the best? Before I say my opinion, comment down below what you think is the best era. There are valid arguments for each one. In my opinion, when glancing at which era has the most skilled players and the greatest competition, it would be the 2020s. However, when you consider the fact that we're only 3 seasons into the decade, it can't be the greatest era, which is why I'd have to go with the 2000s as the greatest NBA era of all time. Like and subscribe, and I'm out.